Welcome to the Time for a Reset podcast. I'm Arthur Nasser, and I'll be hosting the new segment, Inside Marketing Transformation. In this podcast, we'll have insightful conversations with marketers who are managing and leading change in their organizations. We are joined today by Adam Wright at Beiersdorf, Nivea. It's a great honor to have him on the show. He's got some really interesting experience. He's done some amazing work as well. I remember being at the MadFest event last year and he was talking about some of the work he was doing and it was really impressive. So it'd be really interesting to get under the skin of some of that. Adam, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us. Why don't we start by just giving us a little bit of introduction on, what you're doing and who you are.
Awesome. Thanks, Arthur. And pleasure to be here. I really appreciate you having me on today. So I'm Adam. I'm the head of digital at Beiersdorf. Beiersdorf, as most of you will probably not really know the kind of parent company, but is a huge FMCG company responsible for brands like Nivea and Nivea Men. I'm the head of digital for our Northern European region, which for us covers the UK and Scandinavia. And essentially my team are responsible for all of our kind of digital specialities. So things as wide reaching as precision marketing, a lot of the digital media that we buy. What else? So performance marketing, retail media, social influencers and our CRM topics as well. So I've been in the business for about 8 years and it's been a bit of a wild ride, to be honest, obviously with kind of COVID stats in the middle of that. But we've been through a huge kind of transformation journey over that time. So as you said, there's some awesome work that I personally can't take credit for, but it's been a great journey to kind of trying to be on and obviously to talk about it with you today.
That's a very wide remit, Adam, isn't it? You must have so many different things on your plate, not to mention a lot of things on your plate. With all of that, I guess you get a sort of fairly broad view of things. If you did have one wish and you could just change and reset one thing about marketing, what would that be?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think probably, and I'm as guilty of it as most, is probably the obsession with kind of new and shiny things. Can be to a benefit, but also to a huge detriment. I think what's kind of newest in the hype cycle, we tend to get hooked on a bit of a drug of newness. And I think whoever you ask has a brand new technology that's going to kind of change the game, or what's your strategy for the metaverse, or got industry experts coming out of everywhere to try and figure out a technology that's kind of only been around for 5 minutes. And I think for me, that's probably one thing that I would like to reset. And I'm personally trying to also reset as well in terms of my kind of focus, because I think a lot of the time the kind of underlying technology of all of these can be great and a lot of it can be kind of truly transformational, but that tends to get quite lost in the hype. So I've spent quite a lot of time over the last year or two trying to reset and rebalance to focus on things that kind of don't change and that follow patterns. That can be things like behavioral psychology, human needs. All of that, I think, actually makes transformation easier, because I think for me that you can then truly isolate areas that actually have a meaningful change, and that can be to the consumer or it can be to our company's successes. And I think that's probably one thing that if I was to kind of think about resetting something, I think, that's probably if you get less hooked on the newness and more stuff on that might have a real kind of meaningful change.
That's really interesting. I like how you've sort of connected transformation and sort of new technology or those shiny objects. And obviously the shiny object that's doing the rounds on LinkedIn at the moment is ChatGPT, isn't it? I mean, it's fairly impressive tech, but obviously still a long way before that's made the mainstream, I think.
Yeah, and I think that's another one. I think what I'm trying to deconnect myself from is the kind of mantra of drop everything, otherwise you'll kind of get left behind for it. And I've done some experimenting with ChatGPT, for instance, and I agree, it can be truly transformational, but you tend to then forget the stuff that you build a strategy on if you kind of focus all your time and attention on that. So
yeah. So tip number one is focus on the tried and tested, the proven things, get the basics and the foundations right.
Yeah, 100%.
Excellent. So tell us about the transformation work at Beiersdorf then. What does that look like? What does transformation mean in your day-to-day world?
So there's varying degrees to this. So we have our overarching kind of transformation agenda as a business, and that might be the way that we're structured to make sure that we're fit for future and operating in the right way. Do we have the right roles in place? Do we have the right hierarchical structures or matrix structures to govern and kind of set ourselves up right? And we've been, like most big FMCG businesses, have been through a huge amount of transformation over the last few years. And a lot of that is driven part by technological changes and kind of world changes, but also with, COVID obviously did a huge role in influencing that. So we had a big look over the last 2 years about, have we got the right tech stack? We were kind of very heavily, we decided to take on Salesforce as a big tech stack a few years ago, which in order to get the best out of something like that, you have to reorganize and you have to structure your setup in the right way, right the way through to as a local team. And I talked about this in MadFest as well. Just how do we make sure that we're setting ourselves up for the right mantra of experimentation and rapid understanding of what works. And we've got our own vision and thought around how we transform the areas locally as well. So transformation for me is both a kind of top down and a bottom up, and is generally influenced by both like what's going on in the world as well as where the business has been at a bit historically.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So it's essentially you're reacting to what's happening in the outside world. You're reacting to your consumers. And you're also essentially just maturing the marketing function of the business, right? It's about sort of maturity as much as anything.
Definitely. And I think if you look at how we kind of orchestrate ourselves full funnel as well. So beforehand, it used to be planned quite siloed. We didn't really have a lot of interconnectivity between e-com and digital teams. And we've thought very long and hard and made some quite significant structural and organizational changes to make that function better. So that's kind of one example where the move in the market has actually dictated how we also move as a business as well.
And what does the transformation team look like, Adam? Like, how do you structure that? Do you lead the charge on transformation? Is that a business-wide mantra?
I guess it kind of depends on the breadth of the transformation. If I'm leading the transformation, we'll generally import like a project team or someone who's orchestrating that and is thinking about that as a group. And generally, I'll try and get that from a breadth of experiences, breadth of functions, and try and pull that together. So like the experimentation one, for instance, we built a growth team that included both agencies and internal to kind of help drive that. And then equally for the bigger organizational shifts and restructures, that obviously has a core team who dictate and govern that. And then you roll out from there, basically. Yeah, so sometimes it can be very organic, sometimes it can be very planned.
So your transformation is not one big project. It's actually broken up into smaller projects that take place in a team-by-team environment.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's probably the same in most big organizations, definitely. I think it doesn't really make sense to try and do that all as one whole, because not all of the different areas, yes, obviously you have a big corporate vision, but all of the areas have to figure out their own ways to play up into that. So I think you have kind of individual transformation in various degrees within each of the individual org structures, and then you have the total transformation over that.
Yeah, that's good to hear and really resonates. Obviously, change is very difficult. A lot of people push back on change. It sounds like you've got a lot of buy-in from the business to make change, to sort of mature, to transform. Did you have to work hard to get that, or was that very evident in an environment like yours during COVID when, online buying sort of shot up, etc.? How did that happen?
Everyone innately understands that digitalization changes the game and just where the consumer attention's gone. All of that plays a big part then to giving you the mantra that yes, change has to happen or change is inevitable, whether you're on board or not. Like that can be the difference between make or break of a business. So I think that there's kind of innate understanding for that. But then the second bit of it is, have you built enough trust within your business to be able to fly the flag for that and have the reign to actually make that change, and to, do you have got the right resources? Have you got the right people on board? Have you got the right agencies there? Can you make that change happen? And that all comes from also building trust within the team. So a lot of the work that we've done as a team is around that, around how do you build trust in something that not necessarily everyone understands, but people trust you that, yeah, you're kind of going along that right path.
Yeah. I hate to press you and tell me if you can't, but are there specific examples of that you can cite?
So I think probably the one that we've talked about in the past is probably something like experimentation. So, and like driving an experimentation agenda, which with a company like Beiersdorf is, we're not necessarily long-term geared up for rapid experimentation. We're not a Facebook, we're not a Netflix. Our products are innately physical. They're products that you can't hold in your hand. So when you talk about rapid experimentation, people will kind of step back and go, well, our cycle plan's 2 years long. Some of our innovations take 10 years to come through. So how do you take what are essentially kind of a Silicon Valley principle of experimentation and try and put that into a company like Beiersdorf that is traditional kind of CPG? And what we tried to do with that is take some very small steps. So really try and at least in the first instance, not really have a mind of we want to run like 400 experiments a year, or we want to make huge change. It's right, let's start with 5 experiments. Let's see how that goes as a small group. And let's almost test and learn the way that we do that as we go as well. So we set up an experimentation team, was at the start of 2020, with the goal of let's try and run, 3 experiments a week, and let's try and get to a good cadence of that. And they can be tiny experiments, just really small ones at the start. And that's kind of snowballed now, and we've been able to build the resource and everything that's around that. But that started really small. So, and I think that's also built with it an understanding that transformation and change doesn't necessarily have to occur. And if you look at where we were and how our website was at that point, and how kind of operating was then versus like where it is now, it's a huge difference, but that's built through a lot of tiny steps along the way.
That's great. So essentially start small, prove change, prove the case, and then obviously that builds trust, and then sort of leverage for the bigger projects.
Definitely.
Or scale up, essentially, isn't it, when you find the successful formula?
Yeah, exactly. And if you look at the growth of Amazon and the way that we've run that over the last few years, I think that's exactly the same, like successful formula. It helps that you've got transparency of data and something like that as well, and you can kind of see it and you can lay that out for people. So the story and the results are very clear for everyone to see, which then makes it much easier to grow and scale.
Excellent. What are the sort of common challenges that you come up against, Adam? Obviously, by the sounds of things, every transformation project or every transformation track is very different. No 2 projects are the same. But are there common things that you find getting in the way of the day-to-day ground level work?
There's a few things probably. I'd say that the macro environment obviously plays a huge part. Personal changes and big societal shifts and things that kind of happen in the macro environment, which then derails or can put into perspective a lot of the changes that you're trying to drive on a day-to-day basis. So I'd say that's the overarching macro. That definitely plays a part in terms of the speed of change that you're able to enact.
And so are we talking about a project perhaps taking even longer than the market takes to change?
Definitely. And I think part of that is because the speed of change in big global crises, we obviously had the pandemic, we've had cost of living crisis, like all of these things play a big impact even into stuff that you're trying to enact that might not seemingly have a very close resemblance to it. Like let's say some kind of smaller scale organizational changes, but because these big changes then change your business focus, that makes then a knock-on effect actually to how you prioritize and the time that people have to get round the other changes because of the other stuff that they've got on in their mind. So I think it has quite a big knock-on effect on like how you transform and the speed of transformation that the businesses go into.
Yeah. I was going to say, I guess the experimentation work that you did probably really aids in just building the company's capacity for speed and working at pace, right?
It does, definitely. And I think the biggest thing that it shifted is the mindset around that change doesn't have to be huge, like big bangs, and you don't have to wait for the next huge marketing campaign to kind of make any sizable change. There are things that you can go and test at speed and things that you can learn without necessarily needing to do those big bang changes. So I'd say the mindset shift that's driven has the biggest knock-on effect.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned sort of shifting some of the hierarchical structures and looking at roles and responsibilities, etc. That all obviously speaks to the operating model that you're kind of having to look at. You also mentioned data and tech. Are you finding those areas are needing more and more changes? What's your impression on, for example, the operating model, and is that having to happen piecemeal across the business, and how you're transforming those?
So it does have to happen piecemeal because, I mean, any kind of meaningful change obviously starts with some sort of compelling vision or a reason to change. So somebody needs like call it like an enemy or something that you have a real like point of, right, we don't act now on this, then, this is the future and the dystopian future that's going to happen from it. And I think that takes people a while to get their head around. I think whoever kind of comes up with that vision in the first instance has a huge job in trying to get everyone on board to do that. And an operating model is no different. When you're trying to move 5,000 people in a different direction, it's a huge thing that people have to understand, what's the reason and the motive for going to change that. So because of that, there's certain groups by nature that come on board with that quicker. And there's certain groups who tend to drag their heels and takes a much kind of slower time to get back. And I think we're right in the middle of that now, basically. There's certain teams who've embraced it and there's certain markets that have embraced it, but then there's certain markets who don't. And I think I'm kind of pleased to say that Northern European region tend to be on the front foot of that. but you still get micro teams within that. So I think with any big scale transformation, you get a big difference.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'd ask you a perhaps slightly difficult question. Is there anything that you can pinpoint that makes certain teams or certain people more receptive to change than other people? And I'm asking you a psychology question here, right?
Yeah. I've toyed with this one a lot myself. If you think about, like, it's a perfect time of year now. So we're sat in January. Everyone has their own goals for the year and has their own habits they want to make and break, and everyone's in the gym and, you know, all of this stuff. And I think meaningful change and long-term change has to have some sort of big fire or big sort of ignition event that causes that. So I think if I had to probably reflect on it, by not dramatizing, getting a team to really see that change and the reason for change probably has the biggest knock-on impact then to whether or not they are motivated enough to do it. So if you're leading the charge on it, trying to ignite that and trying to find a reason for why that specific person or that specific team also has to follow on down the route, that's going to be probably the difference between whether that changes, how fast it comes, and also whether it sticks, probably.
Yeah, I think that's very well answered. So essentially what you're saying is that part of the job is essentially selling that change in correctly, isn't it? This is why, and getting people to come to the table rather than just saying, here's the change, this is what's going to happen, whether you like it or not. So essentially getting buy-in, isn't it?
Definitely. And I think if you think, you know, people are innately selfish, right? Like people are in it for, you know, what's in it for me? How's it going to impact me? Like, why should I care? Like, I'm going to move and change. And I think setting that and getting people to innately understand that is the difference between whether someone's going to be on board or not. And yes, obviously you can do it hammer and the CEO says so, and so therefore we're going to go and move, which does move some people, but ultimately that doesn't move a culture. It doesn't move anything long term.
Diplomacy is such a big part of getting transformation right, isn't it? It's a people game. You also mentioned tech and data, Adam. What are the changes that are fundamentally sort of having to take place across tech and data? Obviously, things like retail media means that you're having to upskill, to change how you manage data. But tell us a little bit more about that in the context of change and transformation.
Yeah, I think it kind of depends on the maturity of the business. I think with a business like ours, if you look back 5-10 years, I'd say we were fairly far behind where we probably should have been at that point. And that's an underinvestment in, I guess, probably from a people side. Any kind of change, especially with tech, you start with mindset, then you go on skill set, and then tool set is probably the final one. So your technology stack actually should realistically be the last thing that moves along that. People have to understand the mindset around it. They have to have the skills to kind of enact that. And then ultimately, then you should then go and find the tech stack that then goes and suits that. And I think that we, as a business, were probably behind on all of those. I think now we've caught up a lot. And actually, I would say in certain areas, we lead the charge. But I think that's come about by, you know, if you look at, say, something like Salesforce, for instance, that is it's a huge beast that if we're to look in hindsight now, we probably took on a big technology before the mindset and skill set were there. And actually, that's probably a mistake in a lot of areas. I think we're quite fascinated as marketeers of like a tool's going to go and solve all of our problems. Similarly, if you look at something like governing that before you then run into it, actually, regardless, you know, even the breadth of Amazon or the breadth of all the other retailers that we play with, you're never going to get that right and operate in the right way unless you fix those first two.
Yeah. So essentially, you've got to have your strategy right. You've got to have the right skill sets, and then you start to embark on transforming your tech, transforming your data. Because, I mean, as you say, and we've seen this a number of times when businesses bring in really expensive, really complicated tech, and then realize that they don't have the capacity to manage it. And then it looks like a bad investment, right?
Absolutely. And a lot of that is also, it's the same with data, same with everything. I sit on way more data than I could ever use. And the go-to of let's go and solve this problem is let's go and get a new tool, or let's go and buy some more data that will answer all of our problems. And actually, you know, being able to query that in the right way or ask the right questions or have the right understanding of that makes a much bigger difference long term than go and buy something in, because everyone just gets very disillusioned with the technology otherwise, and everyone kind of writes it off before you get the true power of something like that.
Yeah. Tell me a little bit more, if you can, of course, on that data subject. Now, it's interesting that you mentioned, obviously, a lot of brands sit on a huge amount of data. And it's great to hear that you recognize you sit on a ton of data. How much of it are you using? Is that a frustration for you? Are you using what you need to be using well enough for what you need right now?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think we probably have way too much and it's not connected enough at the moment. It would be my summary. And I think this is probably the case for most businesses. I don't think we're necessarily alone with this. I think if you think about the way that our model is structured, we're an indirect business. We sell products to Boots or to Amazon or to Tesco, and they then sell them on to the consumer. So automatically you have 3 stages of data then before you then have the end consumer. So what we tried to do really hard is work to both build up our direct consumer to brand data pool, but also our brand to retailer data pool. You know, what's driving it from a retailer and a shopper perspective, but also what's driving the consumer behavior that sits behind that as well. So the reason that we set up our direct to consumer e-shop, for instance, was trying to close the gap on doing that. And, you know, we're by no means perfect at the moment, but we're a load better now than we were beforehand. So at least I've got now, if I'm seeing something happen on a retailer website or, you know, seeing something happen through Amazon, you have a way to sense check and stress test. Actually, are we seeing that same data replicated if we're going directly, or if we're running this kind of ad set and this landing page, actually is consumer behavior happening in the way that we'd expect something like that to? So that can be a very granular consumer and single party level now, rather than it being like aggregated or mashed up. So yeah, I think to probably answer the question, like, love to use data better than we are now. And we're definitely on a journey with that. But I think we're a huge amount better now equipped than we probably were a few years ago.
Yeah, that's a great answer, Adam. And I think to your point, this is a very, very common thing in the industry, that data sits in silos and doesn't connect well enough. And going back a step, what you mentioned around getting the strategy right, getting the business case right, getting the narrative right internally before you go off and buy a bunch of tech. I think this speaks to that point, insofar as if you understand how data can speak to each other and integrate a little bit better, when you have that understanding, then you can start to think about, right, what technology do we need to actually create that sort of spine, if you like. Yeah, really interesting. Thanks for that. There's a lot of change that's happening. Where do you see the role of agencies and consultancies in that? There seems to be a rise in consultancies. All of the network agencies now offer more and more consulting services.
I think it's absolutely necessary to have consultancies and to have agencies working hand in hand, essentially, with the business and with the brands. I think if you think about our core competencies that we need to build as a business, they're not necessarily in the areas that, you know, the kind of peripheral areas. So creativity, or the way that we use data, or the way that we look at the total retail media landscape, all of those things it doesn't pay for us to necessarily in-house those from the start. Yes, kind of future thinking might be to look at something like that. But actually, if you build a good network and a good agency model, a good consultancy model, that can help you move a huge amount faster than if you were to try and get those people in. Because also, I think what we've tended to find is when you recruit people into areas that are growing, so let's take performance marketing, for instance, if you recruit someone into that role, they're essentially lonely for the first period of time, because you haven't got a peer group to help inform and grow and push things faster or as kind of hard as you want. Whereas agencies are built to help you do that and hire in experts that you don't necessarily have to have on your books from the start. So I think, as with all of these things, it's a continual moving operation for us. But a business like ours heavily relies on those to help us move at the speed that we want to.
Yeah, so those external partners are more and more being relied on to add some of that speedboat capability, get us moving in these very specific areas a little bit faster.
Definitely.
That's really interesting. And just quickly, so, you know, I've only got 2 other bits to grill you on. One thing that I hear a lot of is business as usual gets in the way of the transformation agenda, if you like. You put something on someone's plate and you ask, can you look into this for me? It's not their priority, it's your priority. How do you get around that? And do you find that to be a challenge?
Yeah, it is a challenge, definitely. If you can't get it high enough on someone's agenda, then they're not going to put the thought into it to make a sizable change, whether it's the sizable change in mindset or a sizable change in the work that you're relying them to do to make that change in processes or meaningful change kind of possible. And I think that everyone's got busy lives, everyone's got busy kind of decks and plates and everything to deal with. And I think that we try to work a huge amount as a business to try and simplify operations, and we're constantly on that journey to try and do that, to give people the headspace to be able to separate themselves from business as usual and think a bit more futuristically about that. But It's always going to be a challenge. And as I said, especially with the macro environment where people have got other stuff to worry about and people have got lives outside. And, that also has a cognitive drain probably on people to give themselves that headspace to do it as well.
Yeah. And I guess it goes back to your point of selling in the need for change correctly, isn't it? And if the people have bought into that, that might go up in their priority list.
Definitely.
Adam, I'm going to leave it to you to add anything else that you would want to add about transformation or marketing, or is there anything else that you'd like to say at all?
Probably, I think transformation, when it's talked about, can often feel like a bit of a revolution. So you think about it as like completely ripping everything up. My experience with that is that if you sell it in as that, then generally organizations will try and ignore it probably as long as possible, or certain sways of the organization will, or leave it to other teams. And that's dangerous in any transformation. I think where it feels like something's too far away or it's too big a challenge, particularly when people have already got their own work to do, I think that's probably the most dangerous thing that affects like any sizable change that you want to make. So I think if you can work on kind of lighting that fire in people and you can get people motivated enough to want to bring about that change, then you've probably already made the hardest leap that you're going to have to do in any sort of meaningful change. And in my experience, a lot of that comes with just very, very small steps at the start and building that momentum. I'm by no means, I'm learning all the time on this, and it's an area that I'm particularly fascinated around, how you kind of bring change about quicker and move that in. But I think that's probably the biggest learning that I've had over the last 2 years or so in bringing about change. So yeah, I think that's probably my closing thought on it.
That is a fantastic way to end as well. Adam, thank you very, very much for joining us. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking to you.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thanks for tuning in to Time for a Reset Inside Marketing Transformation. We have a great lineup of guests coming onto the show. If you're a new listener, subscribe and follow CVE on LinkedIn to make sure you don't miss an episode. I'll see you on the next one.